Good evening, everybody. Happy New Year and welcome. Welcome to the second webinar in our Researching Silent Heroes webinar series. And in this webinar, we're going to be focusing on the idea of bringing the war home and researching the home communities. Before we get started, I want to give a huge thank you to Liz DeLucia and the team at the American Battle Monuments Commission, who takes care of, protects, and preserves the monuments and memorials that memorialize and care for all of the people that we are going to be researching and studying. I love the fact that it's New Year and we have so many important stories to tell in 2025. So a couple quick bits of housekeeping. First, I'm going to start off with a huge congratulations. I have to say, the first phase of those research organizers came in last Friday, and I have not even gotten a chance to get through all of them. Your research mentors are diving in and giving feedback, and I'm just kind of spot checking on some different ones, and man, I have been so impressed. There are so many of you doing a lot of deep dives. Some of you have made family connections, looking into things in your community and really unraveling some very interesting historical mysteries. I love the level of thought that's going into the organizers, and I'm especially impressed with some of the questions that are being asked. And you're right, sometimes your research mentors can help you and maybe help guide you to finding an answer. And sometimes we never quite find the answers to all those questions. But I love that you're modeling, not only in your own research, but also for your students, how we ask questions. And I'll throw some things in later that will help us kind of think through and think about some of the questions that one source can create. All right, few bits of housekeeping. Google Classroom is yelling at you, telling you your webinar's late. Don't worry about it. Don't stress about it. Don't email me about it. It's cool. We'll take care of it in the morning. You have access to the Q&A box, and we have live captioning turned on. If it helps you, great. If not, hit that CC button, turn it off. Remember, we take attendance at the end with the survey link, so just make sure you get it before you leave. We'll take the slides, we'll take the video, and share everything up to Google Classroom in the morning. After we get through, now the one thing that's different about this than some of the other webinar series, if you've worked with us, is that in this class, the webinar takes place in the beginning of the module and not the middle or the end. And that's intentional, right? We want to give you the information and then let you work with it. So your goal between now and January 31st is to work on your home front and community organizers. Good research takes time. You're right, you can probably knock it out in a week or two, but it's not going to really have the time that you need to put into it. Take it a little bit each week, work on things, reach out, connect with people, and give yourself some time to get answers back. For those of you studying silent heroes from World War I, World War II, or Korea, we are in the process of receiving and transferring military files. They're starting to come in. I paid for 6 of them right before Christmas. I paid for another 6 this morning. Out of those, I've gotten 2, but it's okay. We're moving at the speed of the federal government, but it's moving. And we're very excited. Some of the files we've gotten are 200, 300. One of you got 600 pages worth of documentation, which is it's the largest one we've ever gotten at History Day. So if I get one for you, I'll put it in your folder and email you and let you know it's there. Now, if you don't have a file yet, please don't stress. Like I said, this takes weeks to get these files out of NARA. They're working their way through our list of requests. They're actually a little ahead of what I was hoping they'd be on schedule. Also, keep in mind that those of you studying the silent heroes from the Vietnam era, we can't request those files because of privacy rules because they left after 1962. But I don't want you to stress about that because we've got a really great example I'm going to tap into a little bit tonight, and some great secondary material we can use to help reconstruct and tell as much of their story as possible without those files. Essentially, this is where we're going to live in January. We're going to work on this module. You'll turn it in on the 31st, and at that point, we'll release the next module, which will focus on military service. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause there and stop my screen share and turn things over to Dr. Hamner, who's going to talk about looking at home front and communities in some different ways. Some ways, and I'm willing to bet that there's some of these images and ideas you've heard before, and some that are going to be a little new. So, Dr. Hamner, all yours.
Thank you so much, Ms. O'Hara. Can you confirm that my screen is sharing?
You're good to go.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining us again. I'm so excited to be able to give a second installation of the program tonight. I am in North Carolina right now on the East Coast, and we're having that wintry mix. So the weather outside is frightful, as they say, and it's nice to be kind of cozy and inside and talking about history. My advisor in grad school would have called this good history weather. So our task tonight in the next half hour is to think a little bit about the nature of American civilian life at home during these four conflicts, and to think about how people who are not at war understand and experience and reflect on the experience of conflict. And I think this is really useful for the kind of research that we're doing, because all of the silent heroes come from communities. All of them are in contact with their homes and families and loved ones while they're at war. And so that dynamic between the people who are at home and the people who are off serving in combat theaters can fill in a lot of really valuable and important and fascinating context about what these lives were like and what shaped them. One of the things that we'll focus on is change and continuity over time. So the wars of the 20th century, there are certain commonalities that run through the experience of observing the war or participating in the war from home. And then there are certain differences, changes over time too. And we want to think about both of those. So no matter what conflict your silent hero participated in, the kind of community that he or she came from and the kind of connections he or she had with that community during their services fills in a really valuable piece. I want to offer one framework that's been really useful to me in trying to understand how civilians experience war, and that's the concept of limited war versus total war. This is a dichotomy you may be familiar with. It's one that I use a lot in my classes when we're thinking about the nature of the conflict. Limited war is limited in a variety of ways. The goals are limited. The degree to which civilian society is mobilized is limited. The means that are used to try to achieve victory are limited. And in the main, most of America's military conflicts have been limited wars in some way. Now, I want to be really careful here. In the class that I taught last fall on war in American society, one of my very smartest students, a young woman who sat in the back most days, put her hand up and said, how can an event in which people are fighting and dying, killing and being killed, how can that be considered limited? And I want to stress that the idea of limited war is something that operates at the sort of societal level. So for your silent hero, individually, the war is massive and all-encompassing. But at the societal level, we do see a lot of variation over time in, how committed and the degree of commitment of the nation as a whole. So it's an important distinction to make. Whatever war your silent hero is involved in feels total to them and their loved ones. But we're thinking here at the societal level. The analog to limited war is total war. What makes a total war total? Well, it's in most ways kind of the opposite. We have unlimited goals or goals that are involve the sort of total capitulation of an opponent, a much higher degree of mobilization of the society, a willingness to apply all sorts of means in the pursuit of those end goals. And so total wars are much less common, not just in American history, but in global history, but they involve a much more complete harnessing of social power and a much more complete training of that effort against an opponent. It might be helpful to think of this not as a binary, that a war has to either be limited or total, but as a spectrum. in which you have some conflicts that are much more limited on one end and conflicts on the other end of the spectrum that are much more total. The Second World War, I think most historians acknowledge, is the sort of exemplar of a total conflict. The Korean and Vietnam actions are much more limited in some ways that we'll talk about tonight. But you can think of it as a spectrum, and also it's useful to think that a war might appear very different to the two sides. So for the United States, the war in Vietnam is a limited kind of conflict because it involves limited mobilization and limited ends. For the Vietnamese, it is a much more total conflict. What they refer to as the American War forces a much broader mobilization. So we've got a spectrum, a range of values across from limited to total, and also the idea that this might be asymmetrical, so that a war looks very different depending on what side you're looking at. These are some ideas that I think are going to frame a little bit of the conversation tonight. They help explain why the United States goes to war in such different fashions. The Great War, the American involvement there, is, I think, more towards the total end of the spectrum in that the government is mobilizing large parts of the society to go to war. One of the things that prevents the American war effort from becoming even more total is the late entry into the war. So the United States is only at war for a little more than a year. In the Great War, that war is waged in a much more total fashion by the British, the French, and the Germans. One thing that stands out immediately, if we're thinking about the American experience in the Great War, is the way the government mobilizes itself to manage the messaging, to put out ideas into the general population about ways to think about the war, what the war means, why the war has to be fought. And this is a really new development in American history. We'll see it play out in each of the conflicts of the 20th century, but this is really new, the idea that the government is going to take an official position and then use the offices of the government to advertise that position. This is where we get into interesting conversations about state-sponsored propaganda in keeping wars going. It really debuts in 1917 and 1918 in the American case. The government sponsors a program of local speakers called the 4-Minute Men, in which the government will recruit trusted people in communities and give them short speeches that they can deliver at their churches or their social clubs to build up support for the war effort. You see on the right there, the Committee on Public Information, which is a government office that puts out short films that are designed to give, official ways to think about the conflict. And this is really new in American history. And partly that's a reflection of the understanding that what is at stake in the conflict and what is going to be necessary to wage the conflict cannot be left to chance. That the public that is going to have to send their husbands and sons and brothers off to the fight needs to be harnessed and convinced of the importance of the war effort. And the burden of sacrifice is spread more widely here. So you can see an American picture. This is the government explaining to Americans why they are going to have to ration certain scarce goods like sugar. You cannot, during the war, buy as much of every luxury good or scarce good as you might like. And here's the government in an interesting way telling Americans you can only have 2 pounds for your family. But look, that's still more than France and Italy. It's twice as much as people in other countries are getting. The government is putting out these messages. As I said a moment ago, this is really new in American history, and the early efforts are a little bit clumsy. Right? Like, this is not something that the government is set up to do. And so some of the early propaganda images from the Great War that are pushing, say, cottage cheese as a dietary substitute or encouraging people to enlist in the Navy, they're done in a kind of crude way. over time, the government's efforts will become a little more sophisticated. You can see in some of these later images, more sophisticated use of color. The messaging has become tighter. The text is, fewer words, but larger. There are some interesting things happening in just the artwork where war savings has turned into ammunition in the machine gun belt on the far left. And the government is getting a little more experienced in selling messages to the general population. So there's a big change over time from this poster, which has the admittedly very difficult job of trying to sell cottage cheese consumption to the American public, to a poster that comes later in the war, which is giving its audience a much more emotional gut punch. Why are we fighting? Because the German militarists here, who appear as kind of this fearsome, muscled King Kong kind of figure with a spiked helmet and a club that seems to be covered with the bloody pulp of his victims, like they are coming across the Atlantic Ocean if we don't stop them in Europe. And this is the kind of message that Americans who are in places like Philadelphia or Trenton or Racine, Wisconsin are getting, the government explaining why they need to mobilize to fight. What we see in World War II takes a lot of those threads and amplifies them. And a lot of the amplification comes from the fact that the government has gotten more practice in managing a war effort. The Second World War will require the total mobilization of nearly every sector of American civilian life. So the government will come in and take over most of the industrial production infrastructure. Here you have a schematic in the upper right-hand corner, in the lower left, a picture from the factory floor of Henry Ford's Willow Run plant churning out B-24 bombers. By the end of World War II, 7 out of 10 American workers are working directly for the government in a war factory. And I think about 3/4 of the people who aren't working directly for the government are working for a private firm that is doing contracting work for the government. So the government has mobilized nearly every worker in some way. The government is mobilizing the economic infrastructure, and we see more advertising to people at home about buying war bonds, saving money from their own paycheck and putting it towards the war effort. And a lot of these posters are getting more sophisticated in the way that they make emotional cases to the audience. If you know anything about the Second World War at home, you're probably familiar with rationing, which becomes much more widespread. It's ubiquitous in the Second World War. Products like gasoline, meat, sugar, rubber, silk, all sorts of things that have some utility to the war effort are purchased with not just cash, but rationing coupons to make sure that everyone and every family gets a share, but that nobody can simply buy up everything and bid the prices of those things up. And there's a kind of interesting implicit idea there about the importance of sharing the sacrifice among not just the people who are fighting in the war fronts, but the people who are back at home. And I think the left-hand poster here does a particularly good job of talking about that connection between the home front civilian and the combatants in the active war theater. So on the left-hand image, we've got a sort of series of shadowy figures in the background, American GIs who are marching. In the foreground, the woman in green and yellow who's carrying her groceries and doing her shopping on foot. And the message across the bottom, trucks and tires must last till victory. Gasoline, civilian vehicles, tires are all things that are being dramatically restricted during the Second World War. The American civilian public is being told you can't have these things just because you want them. They are needed for the war effort. And that text in the middle, "I'll carry mine too," does such an interesting job of connecting what the soldiers are doing in the combat theaters with what civilians are expected to do at home. So we're kind of bringing some connection between the combat fronts and the home front. The right-hand poster is equally interesting, this idea that not consuming things is an obligation of civilians at home. And there's a kind of guilt or shame message attached there. And we see all sorts of efforts by the government to encourage the civilian population to support the war effort, to explain why the war effort is necessary. On the left, you see the title card from one of a series of 7 films, the Why We Fight series. The US government went out and got famous Hollywood directors. Frank Capra did one of these films and said, you need to make a gripping movie that we can show in theaters that will explain to the American public why we have to go off and fight in the Pacific, why we have to go fight in Europe and North Africa. On the right, you see Norman Rockwell's famous Four Freedoms. The American people are being constantly bombarded with messages about why the war is necessary, what is at stake, and why their sacrifice of their loved ones, but also their work and their savings, why it is so, so necessary. A total war in its mobilization of every part of the national economy and the labor force also creates a lot of changes. I think the more total the war, the faster and more dramatic the changes. And so some of the changes that we see during and just after the Second World War in terms of changing racial attitudes or changing attitudes about gender come directly from the need to mobilize the civilian home fronts and to get the population working. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States will mobilize 14 million people to go abroad to the combat theaters. The majority of them are healthy, able-bodied, working-age men, and they're going to leave a lot of empty spots in the labor force. One of the things the federal government tries to do during the war is to mobilize women into the workforce. And you've probably seen Rosie the Riveter there on the right, but there are dozens and dozens of these kinds of images from World War II that are encouraging women to think about taking jobs that were traditionally off limits to them and traditionally thought of as very masculine jobs, that women couldn't or shouldn't do certain kinds of factory work. So we see a lot of change in attitudes about gender compressed into a very short amount of time. And then there's also like some backlash. So you can see in some of the government messages that are going out to the home fronts, a certain kind of skepticism about women's fitness for factory work, or some kind of thinly veiled misogyny here about women need to be told not to take long smoke breaks and not to gossip in the restrooms. But we're seeing sort of new ways to reach out to Americans and explain to them why the war is being fought, why the war has to be fought. I like to contrast these posters with the ones from the Great War because I think the advertising has gotten so much better. This is such a good emotional case. Like, please, this imploring mother, won't you give my boy a chance to get home? And she's standing in front of the Blue Star banner. The civilian on the home front can look at this and feel a little bit of guilt if they're thinking about taking a pleasure trip. And then we've got in some cases where the guilt is just troweled on thick. So here we've got the beloved Cocker Spaniel of a sailor who's drowned. And we know that because the banner on the back wall is not a blue star, which designates a family member serving abroad, but a gold star, which designates a family member who's been killed in the war effort. And here it's because someone has talked, someone carelessly disclosed some information that led to a ship sinking. 3 words, 1 image, but this really powerful message that's being hammered home about what you, a civilian on the home front, can do and cannot do in order to help support the American war effort. And one of the things that I'm consistently struck by the more time I spend with primary sources in World War II is just not just the magnitude of the mobilization on the home front, but also the ubiquity of this, like that everyone is talking or thinking about the Second World War at some point in their week, because It involves so many people, so many jobs, so much of the economy. This is a photograph from a synagogue in Manhattan that hung a sign in the spring of 1944, alerting people. Everyone knows that there is going to be an invasion of Europe. Everyone knows that it's coming. Nobody knows what day it's going to be, but they hung out a banner saying, when the day comes, the synagogue will be open. I mean, these are the kinds of things that you are seeing as a civilian at home 1,000 miles away from the war theaters. That, I think, is a kind of interesting and important contrast to the kinds of messages that civilians on the home front are getting in the latter half of the 20th century. So the conflicts in Korea and Vietnam are noteworthy to me as a historian taking the long view, in some ways because how different they are from the world wars. The military action in Korea is in many ways a product of the Allied victory in the Second World War, the combined and successful joint effort of the United States and the Soviet Union to defeat fascist Germany very quickly changes the dynamics of global geopolitics. You've got a couple of political cartoons here from the years just after Second World War, when America's former ally, the Soviet Union, is dropping what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain across Europe. And that sets up the half-century-long Cold War that will cast a long shadow over the second half of the 20th century. And both the Korean conflict and the American War in Vietnam are best thought of, I think, in some ways as, as conflicts within the Cold War. And you see here a 1940s pamphlet that gives a clear sense of the just general sort of terror about what communism might represent. And the idea that communism was going to continue to expand and that it might ultimately threaten or swamp the United States leads to some big changes in American geopolitics. In 1947, then President Harry Truman announces what comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine, another huge shift in American geopolitics for the president. And in this particular speech, he's speaking most directly about Greece and Turkey, but he is talking about the Soviet efforts to expand across the globe and the American need to support people who are trying to resist that expansion. One of the reasons this is such a huge break is that it's one of the first times that Americans are being told that they have obligations in peacetime outside of the homeland, that American success and American values necessitate going out and supporting or defending other peoples. But I'd point out that the Truman Doctrine, which promises support for people trying to resist armed subjugation, is kind of vague in what it promises. It's certainly not clear the way that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1943 statement about American war aims in World War II was, that America was in pursuit of unconditional surrender. What the Truman Doctrine promises and what it expects is, I think, much more open-ended. And so in the summer of 1950, when communists invade South Korea, it's not at all clear what America's response will be, and it's not at all clear what the average American at home will support. The Korean conflict is a much more limited conflict. The goals are limited. It is not the total capitulation of North Korea, but merely the sort of limiting of how far communist influence can expand. The mobilization of the home front is not going to be anywhere near what it was in the Second World War. And the United States is not going to use every military means at hand in order to prosecute the war. It just feels really different. During the Second World War, these Blue Star banners were everywhere. If you walk down most American streets in towns or cities, you are going to see some of these hanging in the window because the war effort is so total and on everyone's lips. And that's just not the case during the Korean conflict. The mobilization and the war effort are much more limited, to the extent that an American picking up a popular magazine like Life in December of 1950, about 6 months into the war, would have found the article on the right in which the magazine's asking, what mobilization? What are we doing? It's 5 years since the American experience in World War II. And so someone at home might very well have picked up Life magazine in 1945. Now in 1950, they're learning that the war is just not demanding the total commitment that the previous conflict had. If you picked up the slightly more substantive U.S. News and World Report in October of 1951, so about 16 months into the war, you would find the editorial page calling Korea the forgotten war while it is still in progress, which to me was really bracing when I first came across this article, because I thought how disillusioning it would have been to be a family member of someone who is off fighting in Korea, while U.S. News and World Report is pointing out that the war had in many ways been forgotten midway through, which is not something that we see on the home front in World War II. That's not to say that there are no efforts to mobilize, or that Americans are oblivious to the fighting that's going on in the Korean Peninsula. The Truman administration will use the Office of Price Stabilization to try to control prices, wages, and to try to limit the amount of inflation. In 1950, Congress passes the Defense Production Act, which empowers President Truman to take over certain industries if they are deemed necessary for the war effort. In 1952, the president will move to take over the steel industry, making the argument that it is critical to the war effort. And that will lead to a showdown between the president and steelworkers unions, which is really fascinating. We're just not seeing stuff like this in World War II. And on the right-hand photograph, there's some really interesting signs that some of the folks are holding, the striking steelworkers, as they're making their case. There's a couple of there's a multitude of reasons why the war effort is more limited. We've got here a chart of American defense spending in red between the turn of the century and 1970s, and you see there's a kind of spike between 1915 and 1920. That's the First World War. Between 1940, the dramatic spike, which is Second World War. And those first two spikes are very much consistent with the American way of waging war up into World War II, which is to spend a tremendous amount of money during the conflict and then to try to restrict the defense budget in peacetime. We see it creep back up during the Korean conflict, and then American defense spending will never go back down. So it stays, a slightly upward trajectory into the 60s. It spikes during Vietnam, and then it will continue to climb. And Americans don't necessarily want, in the middle of the 20th century, to be spending massive amounts of money on the defense budget. This is a new thing. And the idea that a president might take more wartime power is something that a lot of Americans are pushing back on. There's a sort of skepticism about how much power the executive ought to have, and a fear that any president, or in this case, Truman, might be using the war as an excuse to draw more power to them. You can see, Harry the First, kind of this undersized king, dwarfed by his crown there in the cartoon on the left. The other way in which the Korean War is limited is in its aims. The aim is never to force the unconditional surrender of communist powers. And in fact, the Korean War will end in 1953 with a truce, an armistice that draws a line across the Korean Peninsula and leaves the peninsula divided into North and South Korea, which the division of which remains to this day. There is not an effort to use nuclear weapons and to drive the conflict to a complete conclusion the way there is in World War II. So we've got a limited conflict, limited goals, limited mobilization, limited means. And in many ways, I think the conflict that follows in the 1960s, also in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, is kind of an echo of that limited conflict. One of the interesting things that comes out a lot if you're reading primary sources from soldiers who fought in Vietnam, and this came up a little bit in our pre-webinar discussion, is how many of the young men who went off to fight in the Vietnam War were the sons or the nephews or the very younger brothers of men who had fought in Korea or Vietnam. And something that comes up a lot when I'm reading soldiers' letters or oral histories, they had grown up on the movies of World War II, on Sands of Iwo Jima or The Longest Day, and they had gone to the theater as kids, and they had seen these larger than life Hollywood portrayals of the heroes of World War II. And they went off to Vietnam in many cases expecting that they were going to get their chance to demonstrate their heroism and win glory and come back as the sort of victors of a massive war. And what they got in Vietnam was really different, a much more limited conflict. Here we've got a political cartoon from the Lyndon Johnson administration that kind of expresses the American frustration with having this incredibly powerful arsenal, hydrogen bombs, the most powerful military in the history of planet Earth, and yet unable to impose their will on an agrarian society that had nothing like their technological sophistication or their wealth or their population. And at home, one of the things that changes the way the civilian population experiences the Vietnam War is a new technology that has nothing to do with the military, that is simply the television, just become ubiquitous in American households. By the 60s, I think something like 2/3 of households had one. Everybody had a neighbor who had one. And the television enables some of the really traumatizing images of the Vietnam War to be broadcast directly into the most intimate spaces of American families. So the American massacre of Vietnamese civilians at My Lai under Lieutenant Cowley, who you see there on the right, some of the most bracing still photographs or short films that are taken that show what this war is really like on the ground. The image on the left is often referred to as Napalm Girl. On the right, you see the sort of summary execution by I think it's the chief of police of in South Vietnam, who's executing a guerrilla, an insurgent. All these images go straight home to American dining rooms and American living rooms in a way that didn't happen in World War I, and helps charge the anti-war movement, which gains speed steadily through the late 1960s as the war really appears in all its ugliness and starting to appear in its kind of futility. How much longer are we going to send Americans to fight and to die in this war that doesn't seem winnable? That's an issue that even people at the top levels of the government, like the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, were aware of in 1976. It's not that the United States is going to run out of troops or supplies or weapons to wage the war, but simply that it was terrible optics. And the last thing I'll leave you with before I hand things back to Ms. O'Hara is the way in which the civilian experience of these conflicts, so people who are safe at home thousands of miles away from the battlefronts, their experience of the war often trickles back into the combat theaters and influences the way people think. This is one of my favorite primary sources. It's a Zippo lighter that someone has had engraved in Vietnam. And it refers to the four U's: we the unwilling, led by the unqualified, to kill the unfortunate, die for the ungrateful. And I think the ungrateful piece is referring to the American soldiers' frustration with how people at home were not behind the war in the way that they had been from 1942 to 1945. I'm going to hand things back to Ms. O'Hara now, and I will stick around for Q&A.
All right, thank you so much. All right, let's jump into more of the practical side. So we've got the context, we've got the history, but what are some of the practical tips for finding this information and researching the home front and communities? I think it's really important that in order to understand our silent heroes, we have to place them into place, right? Into the time, into their communities, into their families, whether that was in the 1910s, the 1940s, the 1950s, or the 1960s and 70s? I think we're all influenced by the world around us, by the clothes we wear, by the music we listen to, by the way we spend our time and what we value. So let's go back. Last time we talked about doing a purpose. Throughout this, I'm going to use 4 different examples, one from each of the 4 wars. So let's start with World War I. We're going to start with the story of Ferdinand Egan Deringhoff, which is such an awesome name. He's from Moxie City, Washington. And before we can get to his story in World War I and his final resting place in Musargon American Cemetery, we have to go back and ask some questions about his community. And one of the things that I learned in my historical geography minor at Penn State, which was to put everybody in place and to first stop back and ask, well, where in the world are we talking about? So we're going to start. I'm going to have you jump into the Q&A box. Thanks to Google Maps, we can tell you exactly where Moxie City, Washington is. So we're all the way out on the West Coast. We can see the Pacific Ocean on the end. What I'd love for you to do now is to get to the active part here. Jump in the Q&A box. What can you tell me? What kind of observations can we make about Moxie City? And what kind of questions might we have? And from this, you can draw on prior knowledge, you can draw on the map, or just kind of looking. What are some things we know about this place? What are some things we might have questions about this space? I'll give you just a second here. All right, we're starting to get some answers coming in. We're definitely near the Yakima Indian Reservation. And if I could zoom in just a little more, we're actually very close to Yakima City, which is the closest kind of town slash city in the area. Some observations here. We're near the Indian Reservation. We're more interior. We're into a mountainous zone. You're near the Cascade Mountain, so it's got to be probably a very small town as an observation. Question, did Mr. Deringhoff have Native American heritage? In this case, no, but I'll talk about his family in a minute. Let's see. We're talking about other questions, eastern rural Washington, sparsely populated. Lots of other combinations of those kind of answers. Okay, now pause here for a second. What kind of questions might this map make you ask? We can see what we see, and we've got a lot of similar answers. But what questions might we ask? Because every time we see a source, we want to take what we pull from it. But we also want to stop and say, what kind of questions? So here's it. What did he do for a living? Is this an area with forestry? How did his family get there? What kind of jobs were there? Who were the employers in the area? What's the ethnic makeup of Moxie City? Is this a mining area? What is the industry? What was the community's response to the war? Lots of great questions. And I think it's important to ask these questions. I'm going to be honest, we don't necessarily know the answer to most of them, and we're not going to be able to find out all of them. But it's really important to ask those really good questions. Obviously, we've got Ferdinand's profile on the NHD Silent Heroes website. You can take a look at it. But just throwing out a couple interesting things. Ferdinand is the child of Ferdinand Sr. and Verena Deringhoff, and they had 7 children. I can't imagine, 4 girls and 3 boys. The kids attended Holy Rosary School, where Ferdinand played the trumpet in the school band. And yes, that's pointing to him. That's his actual picture in the school band. His father was a German immigrant. The kids spoke both German and English at home, which I think is very interesting when we start talking about World War I. He finished school and he went to work on the family's ranch in the area. Interesting fun fact, his father was involved in a major engineering project to bring water to this particular piece of farmland. And his father was one of the first people to introduce growing hops in Moxie City. And fun fact is that as today, Washington State is the largest producer of hops in the country. So we might have his father to thank for some things that we might enjoy. And again, a lot of this is some fun facts, but I think it helps give us context to understanding who he was and where he comes from when he does enter the military in 1917, 1918. Okay, let's jump to another silent hero. Let's jump ahead to the Vietnam era. This is one of our demo models that we actually just finished. You can go check it out, about Paul Douglas Tice, who was killed in action in Vietnam. Paul is from Buffalo, New York. And if we're going to tell the story of Paul Tice, excuse me, we want to tell about his community. And I think there's some very interesting pieces to the community. I think we tend to generate and first look at things like war industries. And with some quick research, you can find that Buffalo, New York was a key location for Bethlehem Steel. The photo on the left, which I think is a fabulous picture, is the Lackawanna Bethlehem Steel plant. And obviously steel is absolutely important and crucial in war mobilization. It was also the home of the Curtiss-Wright Corporation, and they made a lot of things like propellers and other components for aircraft. And I think this is a part of the story, but I think if we stop here, we miss other parts of the story. So let's jump in to a very quick little primary source analysis. I'm going to pause for about 30 to 60 seconds and ask you to quick skim this newspaper article from the Buffalo News on August 17th, 1968. Okay, once you have a chance to skim at least part of it, pop in that Q&A box. What insights does this give us about life in Buffalo, New York in 1968? Again, knowing this is one event at one place and one time. All right, we've got a lot of different things. This point about draft evaders, that's right in thing. That's a big word. It's got definitely a very charged word. A couple other observations. Not everyone was supportive of the war, right? There are people who feel very strongly both supporting and opposing it. Draft evasion was a big deal, right? There were absolutely, legitimate consequences for making that decision. I think it's interesting that we're showing that communities are very mixed. Even in this particular church, there are some families who feel very strongly on one side and very strongly on the other. Some other observation, the town was very divided. The community of the church was very divided. And the show says, yeah, this has caused a lot of rifts and a lot of trouble between neighbors or families who are split over this issue. Let's see here. There's lots of other ideas kind of popping in here. I think this idea of like these people were literally camping at the church, this idea of it being kind of a safe haven. Interesting observation, Buffalo is relatively close to Canada. People feeling strongly enough to resign their position in the church. There's issues about people leaving the church, certain ministers leaving the church. And while I think this is a really interesting primary source, it's not about Paul Tice. It doesn't mention his family. But I do think it gives a real strong insight into the community, into the debates and the discussions that are being had at American dinner tables, in churches, in synagogues, in places where people gather, where people, are struggling with what this means and what this looks like. And I think it's absolutely compounded by the idea of being able to see the things on television that, while they certainly, I think, horrific things happen in all of our wars, we couldn't see them on the home front the same way we can during Vietnam. Okay, couple things to think about the goals for this module. Our goal here is to learn as much about the community and the family, because the families and the communities are part of the sacrifice. They're the ones who live with the sacrifice long after. We want to do a little bit of that historical geography. We want to learn about the places where they lived. To what extent some of these places look very much like they do today. Others of them look radically different. What is the economic nature, the social, the political bent of the communities? What's available in terms of schooling or education, work or trade? What religious or ethnic groups live in a particular community? And also, what does the community do for fun? What are the sports, the entertainment, the music? And I think I would need a couple practical tips to help you. I think the first tip, and I think this is really important, is to build from the census records. Almost everybody's got census records. If you look, the third row down is a gentleman named Raymond Bailey. At this point, he's 6 years old in 1940 in Fayette County, Alabama. He will go on to serve during the Vietnam era and return as a veteran. But I think it's important when we look at a family, we don't just look at the one family, but we look at the row. Because when we look down the rows, these are families who are living down the street in the same neighborhood, in the same area. And I know I'm not great at reading this, but I'm going to do a little zoom in. Go ahead in the question box. Just based on the column where we can see the jobs, where people work, how many hours they worked, oops, how much money they made, and did they own a house? What can we tell about this community where Raymond Bailey and his family live? What are some interesting observations we can make by looking at the neighborhood where Raymond Bailey grew up? Lots of color, yeah. Everybody's running out, nobody's owning anything. There's a lot of blue collar manual labor, people working in the lumber company, the sawmill. I think this is really, you're right, there's a lot of connections. This is the Pine Belt, right? This is the Pine Belt of Alabama. And there's a lot of people who aren't making a whole lot of money who are living and dependent on the work that's happening in this town. This also might be an indication there might not be a whole lot of options. This is an area that is segregated. This is an African American community, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of options of where you work. So use that census to help give you a clue, because it's very obvious that many of these families are working in a particular industry. And I think newspapers can be a great source to say, hey, what's going on? Where are these people working? Well, why was this important? Not just to Fayette County, but in this case to the economy of the state of Alabama. Some resources to use: Chronicling America at the Library of Congress, particularly those of you in the World War I cohort. Do a little diving, go down some rabbit holes there. Chronicling America is really great in that window between about 1870 and the early 1920s. But if you're looking for later, still check there. You never know what you're going to find. With an Ancestry Classroom subscription, you get access to newspapers.com. That is an invaluable resource for the Korean War era, World War II, and Vietnam, because the newspapers go on into copyright. Check that stuff out. If you're one of the schools where you're having trouble getting blocks and you can't get to it to a public library, your research mentor, will do a little digging and see what you can find, see what we can find to help you. Don't forget to look at locally available databases, right? What's available through your school, what's available through your public library. Often there might be ones that just cover your state or your region. Those can be incredibly valuable. Also, I'll give a shout out, if you went to a large university at any point, check and see if you can get alumni access. I had a teacher, we were trying to, from New York, we were trying to figure out about something that happened in Los Angeles. Well, I don't have an LA Times subscription, but through my Penn State alumni membership, I do. And so I was able to go on and do some searching to see if we could find the answer to the question. So don't overlook that. You might be surprised by what you can get. Whenever possible, family records. I mean, man, they can just be a gold mine. One of our stories that we have on our Silent Heroes site is the story of John and Victor Akimoto. They were part of a large family. 3 of the youngest brothers serve in World War II. On the left, you can actually see both John and Victor at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, when their sister Jane was able to visit them before they deployed for Europe. I mentioned that 3 of the Akimoto brothers, John and Victor, and the youngest brother, Ted, all served in World War II. Sadly, John gets sick and dies. Victor is actually injured, captured as a POW, and dies in German captivity. However, in the end, they're buried side by side in a row of brothers at Lorraine American Cemetery. And through this family archive, we were able to share the pictures of their mother, Mary. She went by Mickey, and Ted, the youngest brother, going on the day that the cemetery was dedicated in 1960 to visit her son's and his brother's grave. I think that's a really powerful and emotional picture that really kind of strikes me in some very unique ways. I'll throw this out there as a fun fact. Ted, the military tries to figure out what to do with Ted, particularly after the two older brothers have passed away. He ends up with a couple of different military assignments. Long story short, he ends up in the occupation of Japan. He's supposed to be an officer with an MIS unit. He really can't speak Japanese very well. He hates the assignment. He loves to take pictures. He actually ends up talking his way onto the staff of Douglas MacArthur and ends up as his personal photographer for quite a while. After the war, he became an art teacher. He actually spent most of his career teaching in DoDEA schools, mainly in Germany. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And I wanted to share that. I know we have several DoDEA teachers in our cohort this year. All right, last piece, consider community resources. When we think about this module, there's no one way for the story to go, right? Your story might talk about families and church and schooling. It might talk about sports. Maybe you're a person who's really into football or wrestling or baseball, and those local community newspapers love to cover high school sports. Maybe, here's an interesting one. One of our silent heroes worked just like his father had as a beach boy on Waikiki Beach as his job before he ends up in service. There also might be stories of rural communities, and sometimes you can even go see the places where they live, because sometimes these homes are still standing. There's no one story here. There's literally thousands. And our goal is to tell a little bit about your silent hero story. Now, the research process is exactly the same, and you're doing really good work with this. Follow the same path. Identify the source, analyze it, save it, put it in your Google Drive file, put the information in the research organizer, add the questions, and add those citations as you go. Just like we did before, we've given you some questions to get you started, and they vary slightly based on the cohort you're in, but it's the same basic idea. You give us the answers, what you know. Make sure to divide. Make sure that you write your words in your words, and make sure there's something that's a quote. We've got quotation marks around it. You tell us, how do you know this? What's the source? Where did it come from? And link to it so that we can see, and your mentor can check and verify those facts. Remember, that's part of their job too. What other information do you have? And what is it that you still want to know? Think about that with every single source. Also, you're doing a really good job on those bibliographies. Most of the time when I was going in, or different mentors were going in, we were just making itty bitty changes. That little period at the end of the sentence always gets people. I know it's annoying, but it just is. If you have questions on how to cite things, put the bubbles, put the information. Our goal is to help you. You do this as you go. Trust me, at the end, bibliography is just a real quick 5-minute copy and paste job. As always, I know it feels like we've got a couple weeks till this is due. If you need help, please reach out. We are more than happy to help you. We'll schedule a check-in time. Just tell us what days and times you're available, and I can tell you between our team, I will get somebody on a call to help you, whether it's your research mentor, myself, or another NHD team member. We're always happy to do it, and quite frankly, it's really fun. Okay, we are hitting right at the top of the hour. We've got 2 minutes till on my clock. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up our feedback survey at this point. I know we want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're going to go into Q&A. If you've got questions that you'd like answered, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box. We're going to answer as many of them as possible. You can ask about your conflict, your research, something you saw in the webinar tonight, or a research strategy. But please make sure that you fill out your survey before you go, either tinyurl.com/nhd-abmc-live, or use the QR code. You can do it on your phone. It lets us know you're here, but it also gives us the feedback that we use, because I can tell you, Dr. Hammond and I sit and recap after each one, what went well, what we want to change. And if we don't know that you've got a suggestion, then we can't talk about it. So let's go. I actually have a really interesting question from Jennifer here. And I'm going to just read the question out and then have Christopher, you can comment on this and I can jump in from some past research experience. Was it common for soldiers to be promoted multiple ranks during the war? My service member was promoted from private to sergeant, so E2 to E5, a week after he was reported MIA. When he was determined to have died and his remains were deemed unrecoverable, he was promoted posthumously to specialist first class and E7 rank 3 years after his death. Was this common, and if so, why would it be done?
So it is not uncommon for people to be promoted rapidly in wartime, particularly in combat zones. NCOs and officers are killed or out of commission, and so you need to promote people quickly to replace them. This sounds like an interesting, but not completely unique story. My first impulse as a researcher is to think that there is some paperwork that got lost or confused, and so that there was a promotion that didn't go all the way through, things got crossed, somebody showed up, off a roll, and that someone later attempted to rectify this problem. One way in which that can happen is if somebody has been put in for a promotion, is killed before they're promoted, but then posthumously surviving next of kin want to see the promotion go through, not just because of the honor of it, but also it increases their eligibility for survivor benefits. So I've seen examples of this where someone is in a combat zone, he's been promoted to a new rank or promoted a couple of ranks really quickly. Sometimes people are killed or they go missing. Nobody knows where they are. The paperwork gets filed someplace later on. It winds up going through because someone externally has begun to push. There is almost certainly a story and an explanation in your case. And I would encourage you to pull on the thread a little bit and see what else you can learn. It's uncommon, but it's not unheard of. And I can tell I have stories in my own family about somebody who was commissioned as a second lieutenant and within like 4 months had been promoted to captain because they needed a captain in this place, and it was like, you're the guy. So all sorts of things are happening in theater, and it sounds like your silent hero might have been part of that machinery.
No, I think that's a really good point. I think it's also important to remember that while you're missing in action or a POW, you're still paid. So sometimes, the commanding officer, they're really close to a promotion, they will put that through or push that through in order to know that family is receiving that pay, even though that individual isn't at that time. So that's
Right.
another thing that I have heard anecdotally and we've seen. I've also seen when remains are repatriated and right before burial promotions happening. I have seen that several times with different individuals, particularly from the Korean War, that we've studied and focused on. So all of those things are possibilities. Hopefully, a military record might shed some light on that. But again, we won't know for sure oftentimes until we can get documentation. But we can document that he was promoted at those times, even if we don't always 100% know the why.
And if people are listening, so this can happen with promotions, and it also can happen with decorations. So for valor or combat awards, where someone nominated someone for a particular award, and then perhaps the person who had put them up is killed or transferred. The paperwork languishes someplace. Someone goes back, months, weeks, years later, and says that never went through. Like, things will kind of stop and start in the military bureaucracy. And so with both valor awards and promotions, that happens, and you might be able to get some light, as Lynn said, from the military record.
All right. Next question. One of my heroes lived in one place, but then re-enlisted from a different place. So what should I pick for the home front? We find this sometimes. If the person maybe moved a lot of times, or especially if they were a military child, it's very possible they would have different home fronts. I think we have to pick the most important one to focus on it. I think we can still say in life before the war, maybe, so I think we have to choose what the most important was or the most influential. So sometimes we look at the length of the time someone lived there, or sometimes we broaden it out. Sometimes we've done, kind of two subheadings, the first and did a paragraph on the first place, and then a paragraph and did more information on the second place. And that's very doable. If you've got one of these interesting questions and you want to talk it out, reach out to your mentor. Let's figure out what the best strategy is and kind of what makes the most sense for your person. All right, here's a good question. How do we find out about school information? That can be kind of tricky. It usually comes to us a couple different ways. So sometimes we find out school information by starting in the geography. Hey, we know they lived in this town. Hey, we went and researched and this was the high school in those years, or this was the elementary school. Sometimes you can reach out to the school and see if they have record of them attending. Sometimes, especially if they made it to high school, we can find there's more and more school yearbooks being digitized and posted on places like classmates.com and Ancestry that are helping to preserve some of this information. So we search them and find them there as part of the chess club or the football team or whatever it is. Sometimes it's through family information, knowing where they went. Sometimes it also might be searching siblings. If we know that two of the siblings attended this school, well, then there's a pretty good chance that they did, but we'd have to find some proof one way or another. Or we have to say something in the profile like he may have attended this particular school until we can prove that he actually did. Universities, it's less common. We know that American attendance at universities goes up significantly at the end of World War II and continues to increase, but it was not common at all, especially in the World War I generation and those who served in World War II who are a little older. It was very, very rare to go to college in that time. So it's a little bit of research and a little bit of a stroke of luck. All right. Here's a good question for you, Christopher. Obviously, there was less support for Vietnam than the previous conflicts and wars. Was the support or lack of support divided down political lines, ages, regions of the country? How would you address that from the historical point of view?
That's a great question. I want to preface this by saying something that I think we covered briefly in the first webinar, which is that each of these wars has a little bit of attendant controversy. And so that the idea that there is, universal support even for the Second World War is, I think, a little bit of an exaggeration. So there are conscientious objectors and there are people who are, object to the way that the war is being waged, even in a war as popular as the Second World War. In a similar way, I think the controversy, we kind of imagine the Vietnam War as being highly controversial and that there are people marching in the streets in every city every weekend against the war and that no one supports it. And I think that's a little bit, that's an exaggeration as well. There's actually considerable support for the war effort. The Vietnam War effort. There's considerable support even for someone like Lieutenant Calley. The White House switchboard lights up after he's charged with war crimes from people who are calling and saying he seems like a nice young man who's getting a bum rap. Like there is a #1 single called "The Ballad of the Green Berets" that you can catch on YouTube that plays. That is a kind of stirring tribute to the brave service members who are fighting in Vietnam. So like there's a lot of America believes that fighting in Vietnam is necessary to keep communists from invading San Diego. Like that is an idea that has gotten some traction. By the late 60s, the anti-war movement has, I think, gotten a lot more traction, particularly it breaks down generationally. So there are a lot of young people, particularly those who are exposed to the draft, who are taking a very keen interest in what's happening in Vietnam, whether they want to be involved in any war, whether they want to be involved in that war particularly, is of life or death consequence. By 1968, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, this all kind of comes to a head. And so to the extent that it breaks down along political lines, I think the anti-war movement is more affiliated with the Democratic Party. But remember, the war in Vietnam is also linked to the Democratic Party in 1968. Lyndon Johnson is a Democrat. So you've got no simple polarization, but some of the things that I was digging into tonight for this webinar, I found one political cartoon that was 2 panels, and the top panel had a bunch of marchers who were carrying signs that said, "Keep fighting the war in Vietnam," and they were all in their 70s. And then there was the bottom panel had a student march saying, "End the war in Vietnam," and they were all, 18, 19, 20, and it was clearly emphasizing the sort of generational breakdown, which I think is the most clear one. So you've got people who were part of the World War II generation who say, we went and fought our war to make the world safe. And why won't this ungrateful young generation do their part? Why won't they sacrifice similarly? And a lot of young people argued, not unreasonably, that the war in Vietnam was a very different kind of war and was not being fought, was not analogous to World War II at all. So I think the clearest thing would be generational, and then the anti-war protest movement, I think, finds much more of a home in the Democratic Party, although there is a schism there too.
Okay, no, I think that's important. I think we have the sense that it's all or nothing. You were either for, and I think there's a lot of gray area in between where people, just like today, fall somewhere in the middle.
And there's change over time. So, John Kerry was a decorated Vietnam era service member who later became a key figure in the Veterans Against the War movement. And so there were people who come home from the Vietnam War and said, because of what I did, because of what I saw, like, I want to work in the community to end the war. People are really fascinating, and they're complicated, and they evolve and change over time. And so with my students, at least, I'm always saying, when they get frustrated and say, I want this to break neatly into boxes, I say, like, drive at the complexity, like the fact that there's nuance, and the fact that this family had, 3 sons, and one of them was a decorated soldier, and one of them was active in the anti-war movement. Like, that's interesting. That's fascinating. The same household could produce these very different ideas. Like, embrace that rather than kind of hold it at arm's length.
Right, here's another question. So one of our World War II veterans, researchers having trouble finding information about his wife. She figured out that he was married before he left for the war. They seem to live together in Texas, but I can't find anything more than that. I found her mentioned in a newspaper article about somebody else's wedding, but that's it. All right, a couple things to know. Women are so much harder to research in history. And they are for so many reasons, right? They're not written about as much. They change their names a lot, which makes them very much more difficult to track. In terms of accessing things like marriage records, it's hard because those are held by states. And in some states, they're very public. You can find them on Ancestry, right? Some of you have marriage licenses for either your silent heroes or maybe their parents or grandparents. Other states, not so much. I would say, send an email to your research mentor and to me with what you found and what you know. We'll see if we can work a little magic on that one. But the fact that you know that he was married, the other thing we might get, depending on what we get, if they're legally married and he's filled out his paperwork properly, when he died, his wife would have been the next of kin. So would have been the person who would have received letters and correspondence from the government about making decisions about things like their final resting place and things like that. So cross your fingers that we get for World War II, it's called an IDPF, an individual deceased personnel file. And there might be some correspondence there that might give us some other clues as to who she is, what happens to her after the war, whether she remarries or where she's living or where she might have come from. So we'll kind of cross our fingers on that one and keep researching. All right. Here's a question that I don't know the answer to. I want to see if either Christopher or Liz might know, and if not, we'll research it and try to get back to you on this one. If the person I'm researching was missing in action for 10 years before he was declared dead, this is a lot of the service members in Vietnam are in a missing in action status for much later because of the length of the war, the prisoner of war status, things like that. Would his family have been paid the whole time, those whole 10 years? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Christopher or Liz, do you know?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I do know that that is knowable. Like we can get a definitive answer to that question. And I just have to figure out who to ask, but follow up with us if Liz doesn't know, because that is certainly a question that has a, categorical procedural answer.
I have an
I'm
idea
just-
on who we can ask.
Okay. Do you have a guess as to whether he would be paid or not?
Well, my understanding was that while you were missing in action, at least for a period of time, that family continued to receive the pay.
That's my
Usually
feeling
it's-
too.
But I don't know if there's a time limit, because in Vietnam, obviously, they couldn't make final determinations for a lot longer. So that's a good question. And I think we reach out to either Dr. Lair or Dr. Nyberg and try to get the answer to that question. I think we
Yeah,
can
so
get
let
that.
me go on record. My guess is that there is some fixed period of years during which you continue to collect pay, but that number is less than 10.
All right.
Yeah, for the record, Liz does not know. And Vietnam is definitely not my area of expertise. So if you have people to reach out to, that sounds like the best way to answer that question.
All right, well, we'll answer it, and we'll actually share the answer with all the Vietnam cohort teachers so that if this is impacting you, you'll have that answer as well. So really good question. All right, next question. We got a couple more in here. We'll keep going a little bit longer. We understand if you can't stick around, just do your survey and the video will post tomorrow. Okay, Vietnam era service member. Teachers not been able to identify specifically when they joined the military, when they enlisted or when they were drafted. Can we find that somewhere? Unfortunately, oftentimes that's very difficult to find because that's part of that protected information. We don't have access to things the way we have to like the World War II Army enlistment records where you've got specific dates for all those people. Honestly, it's going to come from a family or, other kinds of indicators, but I don't have a specific record I can send you to get you the exact. But we'll keep an eye out for that. This is one of these things too. As time goes on and as we get further from these events, more information becomes public. More files are released. I read a thing that the Korean War draft cards are going to be available on Ancestry very soon if they aren't now. And that's a new record group that they're digitizing and getting out there. The further we get, the more becomes available. That's the best part about web publishing. You find something new in 5 years, we can edit. All right, let's see. Question here, specific for Milwaukee and World War I. Should I look into the general home front in World War I, or just because the World War I home front had heightened challenges with anti-German sentiment because of the large German population? The answer to that is yes, that's part of the story. We want to tell that there's a multifaceted way, and a large German population, similar to places that have large Irish populations in World War I, are going to have a little more resistance to engaging in the war. And if that's part of the community, then that's part of the story.
100%, and it gives you a great opportunity to dig up again some of this this nuance. So there are certain places that have large German populations who are resistant to the war, and it kind of highlights something that has fallen out of most high school curricula, which is that in 1914, 1915, there's debate over whether or not the United States should get involved in the war. There's a little bit of debate over which side they would join. And so it's not a sort of inevitable thing that the United States is going to get involved, or that they're going to get involved on the side of the Allied powers. And there are certainly pockets of German immigrants who say, wow, the logical place for us would be fighting on the German side. So I would absolutely do the local story rather than try to kind of capture just a generic snapshot of the nation.
All right, well, I'm going to be honest with you. This was a fabulous set of questions. I hope we got to all of them. If I missed a question, I go and check the question report the next day, but if there's something that you're like, hey, I need to know this, please go ahead, shoot me an email. I'll get you an answer, or I'll forward it off to somebody to try to get you an answer. And for our teachers in the Vietnam cohort, we're going to work to get that answer tomorrow. And as soon as we get it, we'll share it out. All right, I'm gonna pause us here. I'm gonna say a big thank you to Liz DeLucia and the team at the American Battle Monuments Commission for understanding how important this work is and trusting this amazing set of educators from across the nation and around the world to research and tell these stories. I'll mention that I hope when you're teaching these topics, these tend to come in the spring semester. Obviously, it depends on your curriculum, but most of you will be hitting these topics February, March, April, May. Start to look at these silent heroes and see how you can incorporate some of their stories to help make these topics that are big and broad come alive for your students in some unique way. All right, I'm going to pause things there. I'm going to stop our recording. Thank you all for a wonderful webinar and have a great night. Stay warm,
Have a
stay
great
safe.
night. Stay cozy, everyone. We'll see you next month.
We'll see your research at the end of the month. Good night, all.